The sun hung low over the cotton fields, its light thinning like a worn sheet pulled too tight. Somewhere near the edge of the workers' quarters, Malachi stood outside the master's office. His fingers curled so tightly around the silver coin in his hand that the ridges left faint, ghost-like impressions in his skin. The coin caught the fading light and glinted sharp and clean, nothing like the dirt-stained palms that held it. Behind him, the usual end-of-day sounds tools, clinking footsteps, dragging murmured exhaustion had fallen into silence. All eyes were on him. He was the chosen one. The door had shut behind him moments earlier, and yet the weight of that small metal disc hadn't lifted. It had only grown heavier, as if every whisper from the others, every unspoken hope and envy, was being pressed into the metal itself. They expected him to be gone by morning, to walk out past the gate with a note of freedom and never look back. Some had clapped him on the back. A few had even smiled, but Malachi didn't smile back. Not once. He looked down at the coin again. It was warm now, pulsing faintly with the heat of his skin, or maybe something deeper. The silver had a year etched into it, 1858, the same year his brother had started coughing blood. The same year everything about their world had shifted from barely surviving to barely holding on. They'd told him in the office just 10 minutes ago, "You earned it, Malachi. Loyal, quiet, no complaints, always where you're supposed to be." It wasn't praise, not really, just observation, facts listed out like inventory. And then the coin was placed into his hand, like a receipt for a life half-lived, but obedient. He hadn't said much then, just nodded, thanked them, walked out the same way he walked in. But now standing in the growing dusk with the coin still clutched in his hand, he didn't feel free. He felt hollow, like the wind could blow through him and not even rustle a thought. The path to the front gate led left, but Malachi turned right. His boots scraped quietly against the packed dirt as he made his way toward the rows of aging cabins, each one crouched low under the weight of stories it had no way to speak. He passed Mrs. Ellison's place. She was already asleep. Past the well where the children used to play before the season broke their energy. And finally he reached the cabin with the crooked shutter and the steps that creaked like they had a memory of every foot that ever passed. Inside it was dim and still. The only light came from a cracked oil lamp flickering on the corner table. The air was heavy with the smell of herbs, sweat, and something softer, like cedar wood and dust. Isaiah lay on the cot by the far wall, his breathing shallow, but even. Malachi approached quietly, the coin still in his hand. He crouched beside the bed. The sheets were thin, worn soft from years of washing. Isaiah's chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, like the tide trying to remember how to be strong again. Malachi reached out and gently touched his brother's arm. "I got picked," he whispered. There was no response, but Malachi didn't expect one. He looked at his brother, the man who had shielded him from whips when they were boys, who once traded his dinner for medicine when Malachi caught fever, who carried him on his back when he twisted his ankle hauling barrels before the age of 10. Isaiah was the reason he had survived, and now he was the reason Malachi couldn't leave. "I'm not going," he said softly. "You are." The coin still in his palm had warmed so much it felt like it was burning. Malachi stood and looked around the cabin once more, their cabin. Their home, if you could call it that. And then he turned and stepped back outside into the cool, waiting dark. He didn't pause to speak to anyone. Didn't say goodbye. He headed straight back toward the master's house. Heart's steady steps, slow but sure. In his hand, the coin glinted again under the moonlight. And this time he wasn't holding it for himself. The walk back to the cabin that night had been quiet, but the path Malachi took now away from the master's house and toward the crooked bed where Isaiah lay was quieter still. Not because there was no sound, but because something inside him had shifted. It was like a decision had taken root so deeply that there was no more room for doubt. He was not a free man, but in that moment he felt more certain of his purpose than he ever had. The door to the cabin creaked when he pushed it open again. Isaiah hadn't moved. He still lay facing the wall, his back to the door, the same ragged blanket clinging to his shoulders. Malachi set the coin down on the little table beside the bed and sat on the floor, his back resting against the wall. He didn't say anything right away, just listened, to the insects humming through the window crack, to the breath that wheezed out of his brother like it had to claw its way past everything that tried to hold it in. You remember that day they dragged Ma off Malachi, finally asked. His voice was steady but low, like he wasn't really expecting an answer. She kept shouting at them not to separate us. Said we were all we had, he continued. They laughed. Said we'd forget her by the week's end. But we didn't. He looked down at his hands. Calloused, split in places, worn the way truth gets worn after you say it too many times and no one listens. You didn't let me forget. The bed shifted just slightly. Isaiah was awake or halfway there. A cough rattled through his chest, but he didn't turn around. Malachi reached for the cup on the table and poured a little water from the jug beside it. He held it to his brother's lips. Isaiah sipped, then rasped, "They let you go." Malachi hesitated, then shook his head slowly. They tried. I told them no. Isaiah's eyes opened then, glassy and dull, but focused enough to register the weight of those words. You did what Malachi gave him a faint smile. I asked if they'd give it to you instead. Isaiah tried to sit up, but his body protested. Malachi steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. You stupid fool, Isaiah muttered, but there was no anger in it. Just disbelief and something heavier beneath. Malachi reached for the coin again, pressed it gently into his brother's hand. You should be somewhere breathing easier than this. Somewhere without locked gates or a bell that tells you when you can eat. Isaiah gripped the coin like it might disappear. And you? What about you? Malachi shrugged, eyes cast down. I'll be all right. It was a lie. Not in the way that meant suffering or death. Those things had long since lost the power to scare him. But in the quiet truth that he had just given away the only chance he'd ever have to start again. Still, he didn't regret it. You saved me more times than I can count, he said. This is the only way I know to give some of it back. Isaiah looked at his brother, really looked at him like he was seeing the boy he used to carry on his back, standing in front of him as a man he no longer deserved to protect. And for a moment, the space between them wasn't filled with years or hurt or illness. It was just them. Two brothers, two halves of the same vow whispered long ago in the dark. We don't leave each other behind. I can't take this, Isaiah said, trying to hand the coin back. But Malachi closed his fingers gently around it. You already have. They sat like that a while, the lamp flickering until it faded out. Outside, someone began humming a lullaby only the old folks remembered, and it floated in through the cracks in the wood, like a ghost that meant no harm. Later that night, while Isaiah slept, Malachi walked outside and stared up at the moon. He didn't know what the next day would bring. Maybe the master would change his mind. Maybe the world would stay cruel, but Isaiah would be free. And that for him was enough. The stars above blinked slow and indifferent, but Malachi stood a little taller beneath them. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for something to change. He had become the change himself. Morning crept in quietly without ceremony or sunlight. The sky was the color of tin, and the air held that familiar stillness, the kind that always settled before hard news. Malachi rose before the bell rang, before the smoke from the cookhouse started curling into the sky. He moved through the quarters with the careful silence of someone carrying something sacred, though there was nothing in his hands this time. The coin was already where it needed to be, in Isaiah's grasp beneath the quilt that barely covered his bones. He didn't stop to greet anyone, didn't look left or right. His feet carried him across the packed dirt past the chicken pens, the laundry lines stiff with frost, past old Mr. Kittredge, who coughed like thunder in his sleep and muttered dreams from a war he never fought. Malachi reached the steps of the master's house and paused just for a breath before lifting his hand and knocking. The door creaked open, not by a servant, but by the master himself, a man in his 60s with gray, spreading through his temples like surrender. His eyes narrowed not with anger, but with the weary curiosity of someone who doesn't like being surprised before breakfast. You again, he said. Malachi lowered his gaze, but not in fear. Yes, sir. I wanted to speak on the matter from yesterday. The master stepped aside, letting him in without a word. The air inside was warmer than outside, tinged with the scent of pipe smoke and orange peel. The same desk stood at the far end of the parlor, clean and heavy with ledgers stacked like stone tablets waiting to be carved. Malachi stood across from it, hands clasped behind his back, spine straight. I was clear, the master said as he settled behind the desk. I chose you. It's not a vote. Malachi nodded. Yes, sir. And I don't mean to disrespect that, but I need to ask again. My brother Isaiah, he won't survive another season. I believe he's the one who needs that coin more than me." The room fell into a cold silence. The master leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on Malachi, not as a man, but as a variable one that had stopped behaving as expected. For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached for the coin lying on the edge of his desk, the one that had been returned last night, polished smooth by countless hands, yet still gleaming with authority. "You understand," he said slowly, "that this coin is not just a pass, it's a symbol. It tells the others that obedience is noticed, that following the rules gets rewarded." "Yes, sir," Malachi replied, voice steady. "But I think it says something even louder when someone chooses to give it away." The master's brow furrowed, and he glanced out the window where the first workers were beginning to gather at the edge of the fields. For a long time, neither man moved. Then the master sighed long and low, like letting go of something he hadn't realized he'd been gripping tightly. "I should say no," he muttered. "And years ago, I would have." Malachi stayed quiet. He knew better than to interrupt a man wrestling with his own power. "You're not the first to ask," the master continued, his voice shifting from irritation to something resembling weariness. "But you are the first to mean it. Most just say the words hoping I'll see how humble they are. But you, damn it, you gave the coin back," and walked away. He stood moved to the fireplace and poked at the ashes, as if the right shape of ember might tell him what decision to make. Finally he turned. "Fine. Isaiah gets the coin." Malachi didn't smile. He just nodded once, slow and full of something heavier than gratitude. Relief, maybe, or the final closing of a door he never planned to walk through again. "Thank you, sir." As Malachi turned to leave, the master called after him. "You know you just gave up a life." Malachi paused at the door, hand resting on the frame. He didn't turn around when he said, "I didn't give it up. I gave it meaning." Then he stepped out into the cold air, the wind brushing past him like the first breath after a long-held silence. The fields waited in the distance, familiar and harsh. But that morning, for the first time, Malachi walked back toward them without bitterness in his chest. He had no coin in his pocket, no papers in his hand. But he carried something far more lasting, the quiet certainty of a man who had chosen love over escape and had been heard. The fields stretched before him like a sentence with no punctuation, just rows and rows of burden waiting to be lifted. Malachi walked past them, not toward the cotton, but toward the row of cabins that leaned into each other like old friends trying to keep warm. His boots stirred the dust, but this time each step felt lighter, as if something inside him had been set down. When he opened the door to his cabin, the room was still dim, the same patch of sun sliding across the wall just as it always had. But something had changed in the air. Isaiah was awake, sitting up now with his back braced against the wall, the quilt bunched around his waist like a throne for a man who had survived too much to ever ask for more. His eyes met Malachi's before the door even closed behind him. "Well," Isaiah rasped. Malachi didn't answer at first. He crossed the room, sat beside the cot, and placed the coin gently in his brother's open palm. Isaiah stared at it like it might vanish, then looked back at his brother, disbelief crumpling across his face. "He said yes," he asked, barely above a whisper. Malachi nodded. "He did." Isaiah shook his head slowly, the coin catching light between his fingers. "I don't understand you," he murmured. "You had it. You had the chance to walk." "I know. You should have taken it." Malachi leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice low and steady. "There's freedom, Isaiah, and then there's peace. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes they're not." His brother didn't argue. He simply held the coin to his chest as if it were a beating heart someone had handed back to him after years of thinking it was gone. That afternoon, the message was sent. Arrangements were made. The legal papers would take time. Of course, freedom always moves slower than captivity, but the decision had been made. Isaiah would leave within the week. He would be free, no longer bound to a name that wasn't his, no longer counted in the ledgers, no longer looked at like a number that could be traded or tallied. He would walk away. The other workers heard about it before nightfall. Rumors spread fast in places where hope was scarce, and Malachi's name passed from mouth to mouth like a psalm. Some didn't believe it. Others did and stared at him with a quiet awe he had never wanted. But Malachi didn't explain himself. He didn't seek their approval or their pity. He simply continued on as he always had, carrying water, mending tools, folding linen with hands that had given up everything and still remained steady. But something had shifted. In the kitchens, people spoke softer when he entered. At night around the fire pits, they looked at him a little longer. And when he passed old Ruthie by the well, she touched his arm and whispered, "Your mama'd be proud, child." Isaiah's departure came on a Wednesday morning. A cart rolled into the yard just as the bell rang for first work. It was plain and wooden, pulled by a tired mule, and driven by a freedman who nodded once and spoke not at all. Isaiah was helped into the back by Malachi, his body thin but upright, his coat too big for his frame. He carried nothing with him except the coin in one hand and a folded cloth in the other. A piece of their mother's apron kept all these years in a tobacco tin under Malachi's bed. They didn't say much to each other. They'd already said all that mattered. But just before Isaiah stepped onto the cart, he turned and gripped Malachi's shoulder. "I'll come back," he said. "One day, when it's safe." Malachi nodded. "Don't rush it, just live." The cart rattled off, slowly, the wheels catching on every rut in the road, like they didn't want to let him go. Malachi stood there long after it disappeared over the ridge, his hands empty but his chest full. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the tree line, he sat outside the cabin and whittled a small block of pine. The others thought it was nothing, just a habit, something to keep the hands busy. But by the time the stars came out, a round, smooth coin had taken shape in his palm, carved with care, with the year etched into it by the tip of a nail, 1858. He didn't need the real one. That belonged to Isaiah now. What Malachi held was something else entirely. A reminder, a promise, a quiet symbol of a man who stayed behind. Not because he wasn't brave enough to leave, but because he was brave enough to let someone else go. In the weeks that followed Isaiah's departure, the world did not change in any grand or visible way. The fields still called at sunrise, the air still pressed hot and heavy on the skin, and the overseer's whistle still cut the mornings open like a blade. But for Malachi, something invisible had shifted, subtle, internal, like a door that had once been locked, now stood ajar somewhere deep within him. He returned to his chores with the same rhythm, the same quiet diligence. But the weight on his shoulders no longer came from the cotton sacks or the bundles of wood. It came from something softer and stranger, an awareness that he had done the right thing, even if no one else ever spoke of it again. The others began to treat him differently, though no one said as much aloud. There were small things, the way meals were silently passed to him with the better portion, or how folks moved aside without being asked when he stepped into a crowded room. Once the oldest man on the plantation, Jonah, nearly blind, his hands curled like bark from years of picking, reached out and touched Malachi's arm as he passed and murmured, "You gave your brother his name back." That sentence stayed with him. It echoed in his mind during the hardest parts of the day, when his legs ached or when sweat burned down into his eyes and the whip cracked somewhere nearby. Not at him, but near enough to remind him where he stood. Isaiah was out there somewhere, past the hills and the fence lines and the papers that said, who belonged where. Isaiah had his name back, his breath back. And Malachi, he had this. But freedom, even the kind you give away, never comes without a cost. It didn't take long for the master's tolerance to cool. Though he had allowed the exchange without public protest, there was a shift in his demeanor, a tightening of tone and instruction whenever Malachi was involved. No longer was he seen as the obedient boy who kept his head down and his mouth shut. He was something else now, an example. And examples, especially those who remind others of their dignity, are rarely left untouched. Malachi began to feel it first in the reassignment of labor. He was sent out farther into the fields, placed under the harshest sun and in the roughest rows. Tasks that once rotated among men were now passed to him with growing frequency, and though no word of punishment was ever spoken, he understood exactly what it was. The body suffers quietly before the soul does. The muscles stretch and burn, the back tightens into something unrelenting, and the hands become numb, not from cold, but from overuse. And still Malachi did not complain. Each day he rose and bent and carried and hauled all with the same silent resolve. Though at night, when the sky was too dark to lie to his breath, sometimes caught in his chest, and he would sit by the window with the wooden coin in his hand, rubbing his thumb over the carved edge until he could breathe again. He never asked for the work to be lightened. He never looked the master in the eye or challenged his fate. But there were eyes on him, young ones especially. Boys who watched how he moved, how he endured without shrinking. Girls who whispered about the story in the evenings when they braided each other's hair by firelight. They called him the quiet one who gave away his gate. And so a new role settled over Malachi, not as hero, not even as leader, but as a kind of symbol. A living reminder that dignity could not be stripped even when everything else had been. Then one morning, months later, Malachi didn't rise for the field bell. His legs refused him, stiff with ache that no longer faded with rest. Word reached the master by midday, and though no drama followed, Malachi was quietly reassigned to the tool shed behind the main house, a place where he could sweep and polish and stack without needing to kneel or lift too much. No one said it aloud, but Malachi understood the punishment had run its course. Whether from some sliver of respect or simply from recognizing that a man pushed too far becomes a ghost, the master had allowed a retreat, not a reward, but a letting be. It was in that tool shed with oil-stained hands and the scent of cedar and iron around him that Malachi found a strange, fragile peace. He could still hear the fields. He could still see the fence line from the cracked window above the workbench. But his body was no longer breaking beneath the sun, and in the quiet hours between chores, he began carving again. Not coins this time, but shapes, faces. Letters he remembered Isaiah tracing in the dirt when they were boys. Each curve of wood beneath his blade was a kind of prayer. Not for escape, not even for relief, just for remembrance. For the knowing that what he gave had not been lost. And what he carried was not regret, but a kind of freedom all its own. It was in that tool shed with the scent of wood shavings and metal polish hanging in the air that Malachi lived the next few years of his life, not as a shadow nor as a martyr, but simply as a man who had learned to live within the narrow stretch of space allotted to him. The pain in his joints remained flaring with each change of season, but the work was gentler now, more forgiving. He swept floors, sharpened blades, repaired handles, and kept to himself. No one asked him questions, and perhaps that was the greatest mercy of all. The days moved with the slow, even rhythm of a pendulum, predictable, muted, until one afternoon under the low ceiling of gray sky and the crackle of dry leaves swirling through the yard, something disrupted the stillness. A cart rolled into the clearing, creaking with the wear of long travel. Malachi didn't hear it at first. His hands were deep in a drawer of worn-down chisels, sorting, always sorting. But then he caught the shift in the murmurs outside, the way voices paused and reshaped into tones of recognition and disbelief. He stepped out into the light, shielding his eyes with a hand stained by varnish, and squinted toward the main path. What he saw made the world tilt just a little. It was Isaiah. Older now, his frame thinner, his back less straight, but it was him, no doubt, no question. His clothes were plain but clean, and his hair had been neatly combed back. One hand held the reins of the cart, while the other rested gently on the shoulder of a young boy who sat beside him, no more than 10 years old, with curious eyes and the same sharp cheekbones they had both inherited from their mother. Malachi froze, unable to move or breathe. It wasn't that he'd forgotten Isaiah. He had carved his name into every corner of his memory, but he had long accepted that he might never see him again. And now, without warning, here he was whole and breathing, looking up at the tool shed with a mixture of joy and something that trembled beneath it, remorse perhaps, or awe. Malachi Isaiah called, his voice cracking in the middle, as if time had fractured it somewhere along the way. Malachi stepped forward slowly, each footfall uncertain, like the earth beneath him might give way. The distance between them closed in a handful of strides, but it felt like crossing years. When they reached each other, they didn't speak. Not at first. They simply stood there, both trembling in their own quiet ways, before Isaiah pulled him into an embrace so fierce it silenced everything else. "I told you I'd come back," Isaiah whispered. Malachi closed his eyes, his throat thick with something he couldn't name. "You took your time," he said hoarsely, and they both let out a quiet laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was the only thing holding back the tears. When they pulled apart, Isaiah turned to the boy and gently guided him forward. "This is my son," he said. "His name is Elijah." The boy looked up at Malachi, unsure, then slowly extended his hand. Malachi took it warm and steady and nodded once, feeling something unspoken pass between them. A bridge, a thread, a legacy. They spent the afternoon sitting on the small bench beside the tool shed, not talking much, just being sharing slices of bread, passing a tin cup of water between them, letting silence hold the things words couldn't. Isaiah spoke softly about the life he'd built, a modest trade in a northern town, a house with 2 windows and a garden. He spoke of Elijah's mother now gone and of the promise he'd made on her deathbed to bring their son back here to show him where everything had begun. He's heard the story, Isaiah said, but I wanted him to see the man behind it. Malachi didn't reply. He only reached into his pocket and pulled out the carved wooden coin, the one he had shaped all those years ago, with a nail and a prayer, and placed it in Elijah's hands. The boy turned it over, carefully tracing the etched date with his thumb. When you grow up, Malachi said, his voice steady, and life offers you something precious. You remember this. Ask yourself who else needs it more than you. Elijah looked up, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to carve the words into his memory, the same way the date had been carved into the wood. As the sun dipped low behind the tree line, casting gold into every shadow, the three of them sat quietly, 2 brothers who had endured what should have broken them, and a boy who carried their story now, not as burden, but as birthright. They left the next morning just after dawn, when the air was still cool and the mist hovered low over the fields like a memory reluctant to rise. Malachi stood by the edge of the road, his arms crossed loosely over his chest as he watched the cart pull away. Isaiah gave a final wave, and Elijah, sitting tall beside his father, held the wooden coin in both hands, resting it in his lap like something sacred. They didn't need to say goodbye. What needed to be spoken had already been said in the silence and the glances, in the shared breath beneath the trees the night before. When the cart disappeared beyond the ridge, Malachi turned back toward the cabins. The world around him looked unchanged, the same dust underfoot, the same creak in the water pump, the same bell that would ring soon to call the others to work. But something in him had settled. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting anymore. He resumed his quiet routine in the tool shed, but the work took on a different rhythm. He still polished the axes and repaired the handles, but now he took more time to teach the younger boys how to sharpen a blade without splitting the edge, how to wrap the handles in leather to protect their palms. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His hands moved with intention, and the boys watched not just the technique, but the way he carried himself. There was something in his steadiness that invited imitation. Stories about him had long floated through the quarters, but after Elijah's visit, they began to take shape, to root deeper. No longer just a tale whispered among the laundry lines, Malachi became a kind of quiet legend. Not because he had escaped, but because he had stayed. Because he had chosen something greater than escape. The elders called him the keeper. The younger ones called him the man who gave freedom away. But Malachi didn't care for names. What mattered to him was that every now and then a child would knock softly on the toolshed door and ask if he could help sweep, or if Malachi would show him how to carve something out of wood. And in those moments he saw the same spark he once saw in Isaiah's eyes, in Elijah's, something unbroken. Something still possible. Years passed. The war came and went, like a long, fevered storm tearing at the world's seams. Men came through with papers, with uniforms, and flags with promises of change. And in time, the chains were struck from the wrists, though many still remained bound by memory, by fear, by the slow machinery of a world reluctant to transform. When the plantation was finally shuttered and the land parceled out or left to rot, the cabins fell into ruin one by one. But the tool shed stood, weathered and bowed, yes, but still standing. Someone had carved initials into the doorframe, and beneath them a date, 1858. Malachi was gone by then. No one knew exactly when. Some said he walked off one evening, following the same ridge Isaiah once rode over. Others said he passed quietly in his sleep, and that the boys he taught buried him beneath the tree where he used to sit, carving shapes into the bark. But no matter which version you believed, one thing remained: the wooden coin. Passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, each child who held it was told the same thing: that true freedom isn't always the act of walking away, but sometimes it's having the courage to give someone else the chance to. And so the story endured, of the man who was chosen and chose differently, not for glory, not for reward, but because love, when given freely, carves its name into time far deeper than any coin ever could. If this story moved you even just a little, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love and sacrifice still matter. Thank you for watching and for keeping stories like this alive.